In this video, you're going to hear 3 stories of wildly different circumstances. One of them is completely random, almost impossibly unlucky. One of them is about something malicious and intentional. And the final is about a seemingly good person who is powerless to their circumstances. And although this video contains fleeting and non-graphic descriptions of the events, they are still highly disturbing. As such, viewer discretion is advised. Buenos Aires is the capital city of Argentina and is a sprawling metropolis that houses over 15 million people. This makes it one of the most populous cities on Earth, and the downtown area houses these people in a beautiful skyline. It doesn't necessarily have the tallest skyscrapers, but what makes it impressive anyway is that these buildings just seem to extend forever into the distance. Nestled within one of these buildings was the Montoya family and their adorable little poodle, Catchy. On October 24th, 1988, the youngest child in the family was playing fetch with Catchy in their apartment, and like most dogs, Catchy was thrilled to be chasing the ball. It was wagging its tail excitedly, chasing the ball back and forth across the room, and at some point, while they were playing, the boy tossed the ball just a little bit too hard. It went flying down the hallway, bouncing as it went until it got a little bit too close to the open balcony door. Catchy obviously didn't realize this and was just laser focused on catching the ball. Then she started to skid on the slippery tile floor, unable to stop her momentum. With a yelp, the poodle slipped under the edge of the railing of the balcony and plummeted from the 13th floor. At that very moment, down on the sidewalk, an unsuspecting woman was standing in front of a shop window looking at some of the things inside. Tragically, Catchy fell directly onto the woman and killed her instantly. The impact was fatal for Catchy as well, ending the poodle's life in an instant. A crowd of shocked people quickly gathered around the horrific scene, trying to figure out exactly what happened. From the balcony above, the boy cried out and looked down, desperately hoping Catchy would be safe down below. Across that same street, another woman was walking when she stumbled on the large crowd of people now gathered around the area. Then she looked up and saw the boy crying from the balcony, and unable to resist the urge to investigate, she stepped off the sidewalk and began to walk toward the crowd. In her haste, she failed to notice a speeding bus barreling towards her. The bus driver, despite seeing her and slamming on his brakes, just wasn't able to stop in time. The bus slammed into the woman and sent her body through the air and onto the pavement. The crowd that had already gathered heard the screech of the tires and the impact and all spun around to see what happened. Tragically, the impact was fatal and the woman died almost instantly. Only a few minutes earlier, a man had just walked out of a nearby pharmacy carrying a bag of items he had bought from inside. Just after walking out, he watched as the woman was struck by Catchy falling from the window. He sat there in shock, almost in disbelief, and quietly muttered prayers under his breath. Then, even more horrifyingly, he watched as the woman was thrown through the air by the bus. This was too much for the man, as the shock of the events turned into a sharp pain in his chest. He began gasping for air and holding his chest as he fell down onto one knee. Concerned bystanders rushed to help the man and quickly called an ambulance, but again, tragically, by the time the man was being loaded into the ambulance, he had died of a massive heart attack. In just the span of a few minutes, 3 people and a dog all died in one of the most unlucky series of events to have ever occurred. All from something as innocent as a young boy playing fetch with his dog. Back in 1995, a man was living in a quiet neighborhood in the San Francisco East Bay with his wife of a few years and their 20-month-old daughter. They had a small 3-bedroom, 2-story house, and one of their second-floor bedrooms doubled as the man's home office. One quiet Saturday morning, the man was in his office playing Command & Conquer on his computer with his headphones on, oblivious to the sounds of the outside world. He'd probably been playing for an hour or so when, during one particularly quiet moment, he faintly heard his wife cry out downstairs. Knowing she was down there with their daughter, he pulled off his headphones to see if she needed help with anything. And until the day he takes his last breath, he'll never forget what he heard when he pulled them off. It was the voice of a man with a thick accent who was shouting for her to stop yelling or he would kill her and then assault her daughter. The man could also hear his daughter crying hysterically. After that, it was like some switch flipped inside the man and his higher brain just shut off. He wasn't making decisions, he was just acting. He doesn't even remember pulling the .45 from the lockbox in his desk. He just remembers walking down the stairs slowly, scared that he was going to see his wife dead when he reached the bottom. Instead, as he got to the bottom of the stairs, he saw his wife half naked being assaulted by some burly guy with a knife in his hand. The man didn't say a word to the guy, not while he was upstairs, not while he was coming down the stairs, and not when he walked into the room. His back was to the man, so he had no idea he was even standing there. He was holding his knife in his right hand, so that was the arm he grabbed with his left when he pulled him off. The intruder spun away from his wife and him with a confused look on his face, and the man then shot him square in the chest at nearly point-blank range. His face went pale as he went down onto one knee, and then the man fired twice more. One hit his neck, and the second missed entirely. What happened next has always been a point of shame for the man. The only thought going through his head at that point was that he couldn't let his daughter watch this man die. Without even checking on his wife, he scooped his daughter up and walked out the front door. As he walked out to his driveway, he saw one of his neighbors standing there. The neighbor had heard the gunshots and came to check on the man and his family. The neighbor went completely pale when he saw the man walk out, and then he vaguely remembers asking him to hold his daughter while he went to check on his wife. The neighbor asked the man if he had shot her, and he told him, "No, I shot the man who was assaulting her." What the man didn't realize at the time was that he had the guy's blood spray covering half his body, and that he looked like something out of a horror movie. He then handed the neighbor his daughter and his gun, and then he went back inside the house to help his wife. The police later gave the man some flack about the exact circumstances of the shooting, because one of the detectives told him that it was more like an execution than a defense, but in the end, they declined to pursue any charges. The man who attacked her turned out to be a guy with serious issues who had been previously convicted of 2 similar incidents, one of which was against a minor. Under California's then new 3 strikes law, he'd have been given prison for life if the man hadn't killed him. In the years following the incident, the man likes to think that he's recovered, but it certainly induced a few behavioral changes. To this day, for example, he can't wear headphones that block out background noise. Even after years of counseling, over-ear and noise-canceling headphones give him panic attacks because he can't hear what's happening around him. He also found out that the attack had been going on for nearly 10 minutes before he heard him, and that he'd actually told his wife 3 times that his daughter was next when he finished with her. He was sitting 30 feet away and had no idea what was going on, and that fact has messed with him for years. His wife, on the other hand, has had a much worse time of it. In addition to 2 stab wounds to her shoulder and upper arm and the bruising and injuries from the forceful assault, she ended up having a mental break and took years to finally recover. For the first 6 months, she absolutely could not be in any room by herself. For more than a year, she couldn't be in the house by herself, and she never re-entered the house where the incident happened. For several years after, she'd break out in a sweat whenever she heard a man with a deep accent talking because she'd hear his voice again. And even now, decades later, she starts shaking if you try to talk to her about it. She's fine in every other sense, but even discussing it freaks her out. In the spring of 1990, 16-year-old Benita Jacks began attending high school in Charles County, Maryland, which is just a few miles south of Washington, D.C. She had always struggled to keep up with her peers academically, but high school ended up being even more challenging than she expected. Like many teenagers her age, Benita had 1 or 2 love interests, but nothing too serious. However, despite not being in a relationship and being just 15 years old, after entering 10th grade, Benita found out that she was pregnant. While not uncommon, it's not exactly an ideal situation for any teenage girl to be in. This is especially true if they live in an area with notoriously bad public services. This would be a reoccurring issue in not only Benita's life, but her children's lives as well. It wasn't long until Benita dropped out of school to take care of her child and to find a job to help provide for the both of them. Then, after giving birth to her daughter Brittany, she began pursuing a career as a hairdresser. Despite these early struggles, Benita persevered and worked hard and did what she could to be a good mother to her daughter. Then, a few years after dropping out, in hopes of finding out who the father was of her daughter, she filed a paternity petition against a man from Waldorf, Maryland. That same year, she found out she was pregnant again and gave birth in 1997 to a girl named Tatiana. This time, rather than waiting, she filed a second paternity petition shortly after the birth. The hope was that after establishing who the father was, Benita would have some help raising her children, either through child support or simply having the father in her children's lives. Another few years later, in the year 2000, Benita was still working as a hairdresser when a young man named Nathaniel became one of her clients. After several appointments, the 2 of them got along really well and there seemed to be some chemistry between them, so not long after that, they began dating. Then, not long into their dating, the couple had 2 more children, a daughter named Nikaya and another named Asia. It's unknown exactly what kind of relationship Benita and Nathaniel had, or whether Brittany and Tatiana got along with him, but both of their fathers had done little to nothing in the way of co-parenting. With their mother working regularly for a hair salon, she couldn't always be there for them like she wanted to be. Thankfully, Nathaniel not only provided them with a much-needed male role model, but he also helped to keep their mother grounded. And as you'll find as this story unfolds, Benita must have loved him dearly. At some point in 2005, Benita and her children were evicted from an apartment she was renting. She then asked her mother if she could live with her until she could find another place to rent, but when she asked her mother if Nathaniel could move in as well, her mother's answer was no. So not long after that, she left her mother's house to live with Nathaniel, taking the 4 girls with her. The family of 6 moved from one place to another, sometimes living with friends and sometimes living in homeless shelters. DC winters can get pretty cold, so they were forced to stay in specially designated places called hypothermia sites in late 2005. Many of these hypothermia sites are operated by non-profit and governmental organizations and try to offer families help in getting assistance. And because Benita and Nathaniel had 4 children, the shelter helped to find them emergency housing. Unfortunately, even though it's called emergency housing, it can take several months before a family is placed into a low-income home. As 2006 rolled around, the family was still homeless, sometimes staying at shelters and other times sleeping in their vehicle as the months turned warmer. Finally, in August of 2006, a non-profit organization helped the family move into a row house in Washington, D.C. It seemed like after some more hardships, things were finally turning around for the young family once again. Unfortunately, this was far from the case. Around this same time period, Nathaniel began getting progressively sicker. It's unclear whether he knew it or not, or simply brushed off the symptoms as something minor, but eventually he was diagnosed with some form of sinus cancer. Tragically, by the time it was discovered, it had already spread extensively throughout his body. By then, it was too late, and Nathaniel passed away on March 16, 2007, at the age of 37. After Nathaniel passed away, Benita's friends and family pretty quickly noticed a change in her behavior. The first odd thing was that she chose not to attend Nathaniel's funeral. This could have been attributed to her grieving process because everyone deals with death in their own way. However, those who were close with her and her girls learned that Benita hadn't even told her daughters Nathaniel had passed. She also began to gradually isolate herself and the children from others. Neighbors noticed that they went from always wearing nice clothes and having their hair made up to wearing the opposite and generally looking run down. Benita also told friends and neighbors they were out of food stamps, and when asked why she didn't apply for more, her reply was that there was too much paperwork to fill out. Following Nathaniel's funeral as well, Benita's mother stopped by her home on several occasions, but each time, her daughter wouldn't let her into the home. Sometimes she would even call her mother without coming to the door and tell her not to come back. By this point in time, the oldest daughter, Brittany, was a teenager and started dating a boy from her school. Then, around the beginning of March, he noticed that she just stopped showing up to school one day, and even before she stopped showing up, she looked depressed and out of it. He visited her briefly to see if there was anything he could do for her, but she didn't really give him a clear answer about what was going on. And after that, Brittany started ignoring his calls entirely. At some point, people began to worry about the 4 girls' well-being. In particular, during the months of April and May 2007, a social worker from their school repeatedly tried to contact Brittany to see if she was okay. After being unable to reach her, the social worker decided to simply go to Benita's home on April 27th with a police officer. Unfortunately, without a warrant, Benita was able to refuse her and the officer entry to her home. While they were there though, as they stood at the door looking in, the social worker was able to see that Nakia and Asia looked like they were in rough shape, and the home was just as bad. After leaving, and after seeing the state that Benita and her home were in, the social worker repeatedly called Child and Family Services to report the issue. 3 days later, as a result of the calls, a DC police sergeant went to Benita's home to interview her. As with the other visits, she refused to allow the officer into the home and spoke with the officer in the front yard. While he was there, he saw the 3 younger girls, but didn't see Brittany anywhere. Then, after leaving the home, the sergeant, for whatever reason, didn't file his report until months after the initial visit. In the report as well, he mentioned never knowing about Brittany, despite the fact that the social worker was very explicit on the phone about the 4 children. Then, on May 10th, so about 2 weeks after the first visit, the same social worker got even more concerned about the welfare of the children after hearing nothing back from the police. Also fearing that something had happened to Brittany or that she was being held against her will, she wrote a letter to the DC Youth Social Division. But then, even more frustratingly, social workers essentially ignored her letter and never went to check on Brittany or the other 3 girls. Then, not long after, neighbors started to notice a smell. This smell seemed to permeate the entire area. Many of the people living in the area figured it was some sort of animal that had died nearby or on the rooftop, or something along those lines. During this time as well, a neighbor of Benita's would come by on a semi-regular basis and drop off her social security checks, and always saw Nakia and Asia playing in the living room. Not thinking much of it at the time, the neighbor would later realize that she hadn't seen Benita's other 2 daughters in months. By midsummer of 2007, it had also been months since Benita had paid the rent for their apartment. With an eviction notice in hand, federal marshals arrived at her home on January 9th, 2008. By then, it had been around 8 months since anyone saw Brittany, and around 7 since any of the other girls had been seen. In addition to that, the foul odor had gotten much, much worse. Benita answered the door wearing a grungy white t-shirt that had brownish smudges on it. Like other times, she tried to refuse them entry into the home, but these were federal marshals with an eviction notice. Benita tried to shut and lock the door, but one of the marshals stuck his boot in before she could close it. The marshals then forced their way into the apartment and were instantly hit with a smell that many police officers immediately recognized. Benita tried to stall the marshals and even attempted to block them from walking up the stairs toward the children's rooms, but eventually she had no choice but to let them pass. As they made their way up the dark staircase, the smell of something rotting got even more pungent. As one of the marshals looked into the first bedroom, he saw 3 small bodies. They were in a terrible state, showing signs of advanced decomposition. Going down the hallway, the marshals eventually found Brittany lying on the floor in a pool of dried blood. Her body was decomposed beyond recognition. Following a medical examination, it was determined that there were puncture wounds and blunt force trauma on each of them, but because of the state of decomposition, it was difficult to determine the exact cause of death. Incredibly, despite the very obvious signs of foul play, Benita claimed all 4 girls had passed away in their sleep. She also claimed to have tried to revive them despite not knowing CPR. After a further search of the home, they found that there was no food anywhere, most of the furniture had been removed, and the room Brittany was in was locked from the outside. It looked as though she had also been forced to use the closet as a washroom. In a series of police interrogations, the circumstances of what happened would finally be learned. Following the death of Nathaniel, it seems as though something snapped inside Benita. Soon after his death, she had a dream where he visited her and told her that all 4 of her children would be taken from her but then resurrected. According to Benita, each of her children had become possessed and she took extreme measures to deal with them. The first was Brittany, who she had the most confrontations with. The 2 of them had fought on several occasions and she eventually locked her in her room to prevent her from influencing the other children. During this time as well, all 4 of them hadn't had a proper meal in some time, and this eventually took its toll. Benita would even say that as they got weaker, the demons got weaker. Following their deaths, Benita claimed that demons had a different smell, forcing her to throw away all of her furniture. She felt that once everything had been taken care of, she and Nathaniel would be reunited together, along with her 4 daughters. Ultimately, she was charged with 12 felonies and pled not guilty to all charges. She was advised by her lawyers to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, but she refused. She was eventually sentenced to 120 years in prison, or 30 years for each of them. Benita also wouldn't be the only one thought to be responsible for what happened. Several district agencies were later found to be negligent, and 6 social workers were fired for their part in ignoring or mishandling what was going on with the girls. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, you can send it to the email found in the description or on the Scary Interesting subreddit. If you want to support the channel, give this video a like and subscribe if you aren't already so you don't miss any of the weekly videos. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.